Just 1 week before I went on sabbatical, I learned of a special guest who would be preaching at Turner Chapel AME, African Methodist Episcopal, just a mile from my home. The guest preacher was the Reverend Jeremiah Wright. You may recognize the name. Wright is Minister Emeritus of a United Church of Christ congregation in Chicago, and he was Barack Obama's pastor for many years. That's another story. I didn't know that much about Jeremiah Wright, except that he had a reputation for speaking what I believe to be the unvarnished truth. And so last July, just 4 days before I went on my sabbatical, I went with eager anticipation to hear what Jeremiah Wright had to say. I was not disappointed. Jeremiah Wright described in vivid terms the continuing racism in our country. Wright explained to the audience at Turner Chapel that when he described this racism to other groups, a common reaction by those other groups from hearing these truths is, WTF? Hearing this, the audience at Turner Chapel, 1,000 African Americans, howled with laughter and approval. Wright continued. He said, now, some of the older saints here at Turner Chapel may not know what WTF means. It means, he said, what's this foolishness? More on that in a moment. When I returned from my sabbatical, my wife Carol provided me with a set of newspaper articles that she thought I would be interested in. One stack of related articles jumped out at me, as Carol thought it would. The first article was a charge of racial bias against a Cobb County police officer. On November the 16th, the white officer was recorded telling a black motorist, "Go to Fulton County, cuz, and I don't care about your people." In the recording, the black motorist accused the police of harassment and compared them to the Gestapo. It was a heated exchange. The article continued. This was the second complaint against this Cobb County police officer. The first complaint was filed by Cobb County Commissioner Lisa Cupid, who is African American, 4 months earlier. At the time, Commissioner Cupid wrote a memo to her fellow commissioners, to the Cobb County Commission chair, to the county manager, the director of public safety, and the chief of police. In her memo, Cupid stated that she was driving home from a study session for the state bar exam at the Wingate Hotel. She left the hotel at 1:30 a.m. in the morning when she noticed a gray unmarked car following her. Cupid said the car followed her for 2 miles to her home and continued to follow her when she began driving around the neighborhood to get away from the car. Cupid said the car accelerated behind her as she fled the subdivision. She called 911 as she pulled into a Quick Trip gas station on Six Flags Drive. When uniformed officers arrived, they told her the unmarked car was an undercover police officer who was investigating a string of reported car thefts in the area. Cupid was told that the officer ran her license plate and when learning of Cupid's identity, he stopped following her. Cupid's memo continues. I believe that the officer who followed me had complete and utter disregard for my safety, my well-being, and the sanctity of community. He was there to harass and intimidate me, she wrote. I shudder to think if I was an ordinary citizen, especially a young black man, I would have ended up in handcuffs that night. 12 hours later, Public Safety Director Sam Heaton ordered all undercover operations stopped, but just a few days later cleared the officer of all wrongdoing, stating the officer followed standard police protocol. Within the next month, Cupid made repeated requests for the creation of an independent citizen advisory committee to review police procedures, policies, and practices. One of her fellow commissioners said that Cupid's allegations were very disappointing. This commissioner supported the police 100%. Another commissioner said that Cupid owed an apology to police and that her comments have created a divisiveness on the board. By mid-August, Cupid's request for a citizen advisory committee was denied. In October, Cupid announced that she would go forward with the creation of a citizen review board without the Board of Commissioners' approval. She wrote in a community newsletter, "The function of the board is to reach out to people who have made complaints to my office, to document the complaints in a manner that accurately conveys the concern of constituents, and provide me copies of the complaints so I can be better prepared to address the matters with the Department of Public Safety." On December 5th, Marietta Daily Journal columnist Dick Yarborough wrote that the officer involved in both of these instances, the one 4 months ago, the one in November, was later heard to say to unidentified police officers, to unidentified fellow officers, "I lose my cool, man, every time. Why do I get to deal with expletive like that? This is the expletive America we live in, ain't it?" In mid-December, the Cobb County chairman called for an official evaluation of Cobb policing policies. Lisa Cupid was surprised by the move. She hadn't been informed, but welcomed it. When the chairman introduced the motion a week later, he took direct aim at Lisa Cupid. He said, quote, "I am tired of the public accusations and assertions about our police department. I'm disappointed that the chief perpetrator of these accusations is a commissioner who is not being constructive about seeking legitimate solutions to what she asserts is wrong." He criticized Cupid's creation of a grievance committee and further accused Cupid of creating a media spectacle. After reading this collection of articles provided by Carol, my response was visceral. What's this foolishness? And so my sermon is going in a different direction than published in the January newsletter. I originally intended to talk about institutional racism, and in a sense, I'm still talking about it, but with a different focus. Before I do, though, let me talk about just mention the traditional understanding of institutional racism. It refers to the racism not of an individual, but to the structures and processes that perpetuate racism. For example, 2 years ago, I preached on the new Jim Crow, in which law enforcement and the criminal justice system follow practices and procedures that result in significantly higher arrests, convictions, and incarceration rates among African Americans when committing the same crimes and the same rates as whites. That's institutional racism. One of the most insidious practices in my mind is known as environmental racism. It speaks to practices where the placement of landfills and exposure to toxic pollutants are more likely to occur in impoverished neighborhoods or in communities of color. There are other examples. Banking practices, for example, that make it harder for African Americans to purchase homes. Therefore, they have less equity, and the system perpetuates. In other words, institutions can be just as racist as individuals. They use power and influence to favor whites, thus perpetuating the overt racism of the past. This morning, given the recent events in Cobb County, instead of speaking about the institutional racism I just described, I want to talk about the reactions of whites to the charges of racism in our community. These reactions include everything from the actions and reactions of the white police officer to the defensive reactions of our county commissioners to the verbal attack by the Cobb County Commission chairman. To do so, I will draw on an article titled, "Why White People Freak Out When They're Called Out About Race." It was written by Professor Robin DiAngelo, a multicultural educator. The article speaks quite poignantly to what DiAngelo calls white fragility. I'd want to lift up 4 factors that were spoken to directly or alluded to in the article. The first is what I will refer to as white blindness, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say nearsightedness. This is certainly not limited to whites, but when talking about racism, it is important to understand how nearsightedness applies to whites, to white people. Whoever we are, we look through a subjective lens, formed by history or upbringing or culture or experience. And I believe that being white makes it difficult, and I will say impossible, to fully understand the racist experiences of most, if not all, African Americans. It is simply impossible to grasp the daily, subtle and not so subtle ways in which the ugliness of racism continues. This nearsightedness makes it easy to dismiss the incidents in Cobb County as isolated incidents that can be handled administratively and in isolation. The second factor in understanding white fragility is to fully understand privilege. The freak out that the article refers to is often an emotional response by someone who is asked to reflect on their own accomplishments and the role of being white, and I might add of being male, what role this played in their accomplishments. The emotional response is often a defensive one, in which the person speaks to their own qualifications and accomplishments. The response makes no mention of existing white privilege and how that might have played a role. The response often cites that the time of discrimination has passed and that whites and blacks now play on an even playing field. With regard to privilege, we need to understand that the Cobb County Police Department is almost entirely run by white men. I was able to find one precinct captain who I think is Asian American. And this, like other forms of privilege, is a vestige of our history. It is not an indictment of individuals, but a recognition of the current role of white privilege. A third factor is perhaps the key factor in understanding white fragility. Racism is often thought of as differentiating good people and bad people, moral and immoral acts. And because we think of ourselves as good people, it would be impossible for us to engage in such immoral acts. So the thinking goes. Here is a quote from DiAngelo. In large part, white fragility, the defensiveness, is rooted in this good-bad binary. If you call someone out, meaning you associate their actions with racism, they think to themselves, when you just said, or what you just said, was that I'm a bad person and that is intolerable to me. I wish the Cobb County Commissioners could hear Lisa Cupid's comments differently. Not as an indictment of the police force. Not that the police force is bad or evil. It's not binary. Not as an indictment of each individual in the system, but that practices and procedures must be re-examined. Officers may need additional training, and we need deeper conversations about race. There is one final component spoken about in D'Angelo's article, and it is something I struggle with personally. We want black people, so the article goes, when they call out racism, to say it nicely. But D'Angelo says we have to build our stamina to just be humble and bear witness to the pain we've caused. And the we is a collective we. It is the we of our history. It is the we of people who look like most of us. It is the we that led to white privilege. D'Angelo writes, it's like if you're standing on my head and I say, get off my head, and you respond, well, you need to tell me nicely. I can't actually read the next response, but saying you need to tell me nicely is not likely to generate a nice response. In my own work in nonviolent communication, there is a related sentiment to what D'Angelo is asking us to do. In nonviolent communication, when we hear anger about any issue, our task is to listen for the need being expressed, even and especially if it is being expressed angrily. Listening for the needs does not mean that I am responsible. Does not mean that I am personally to blame for the anger that is being expressed. And next week I'm going to talk a lot about this and some real eye-opening things that happened with me in my sabbatical. Pat Burns, and it will be recorded, choir. Pat Burns, a friend of mine, wrote an insightful editorial for the Marietta Daily Journal on September 12th. Carol, you missed that one in the list of articles. But Pat told me. Pat notes that instead of hearing Lisa Cupid's concerns and taking them seriously and being willing to look more deeply at practices and procedures in Cobb County, Cupid herself became a target of hate. This is deeply troubling. Pat compassionately identifies with Lisa Cupid and the fear she felt at being followed by an unmarked car to her home. Pat further chided police for their failure to take responsibility for their actions. What got me the most is the apologies that said, "We're sorry that you were frightened." Pat also calls to task those, including Cupid's fellow commissioners, for publicly questioning her integrity. And others, and we know how this works in the Marietta Daily Journal, others engaged in blaming the victim, writes Pat, commonly used against women and girls, thus making Commissioner Cupid the perpetrator.